Trump, it would have been a very different messaging.
I'm joined by Dr. Irfan Noureddin. He is a professor at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Welcome, Dr. Noureddin. Now, we're speaking today because we're a few days ahead of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's first state visit to the U.S. What is the significance of this visit to your mind?
So we have a state visit, which is the highest level of visit afforded a head of government. Mr. Modi has also been invited to do a joint address to Congress. This is the second time he's doing it, so he joins a very rare company of leaders. Winston Churchill had the honor of addressing Congress twice, now Modi. So it's an affirmation that India is firmly part of the US plans for the 21st century. It is also an affirmation for Mr. Modi that his rehabilitation, if you would, on the world stage as a world statesman, a decade ago he was not even allowed a visa to come to the United States because of controversy surrounding his rule when he was the chief minister of Gujarat. And now he's finally getting a state dinner, a state visit, addressing Congress. But on a geopolitical sense, it just tells us that the US-India relationship has the highest level buy-in in both countries. And for better or for worse, is going to be a fixture of the next 20, 30, 50 years in world politics.
I'd like to ask you a bit more on this point of rehabilitation, because it's not as if Modi is not the object of some controversy still in terms of his human rights record, targeting dissidents, targeting journalists, religious minorities. Does this mean that because of India's significance on the geopolitical stage, everybody has to sort of make a pragmatic arrangement with his human rights record?
Exactly that. I mean, so this is realpolitik, realism on the world stage, really the X factor here being China, and the fact that both India has a land border with China that's very conflicted. India is threatened by China. The United States sees China as the single biggest security threat in the 21st century. That is the common cause that brings them together. Against that backdrop, you do have the awkward reality that India's democracy is not as robust as it has been in the past. Real questions about its human rights record, its treatment of religious minorities, of press, of civil society. So Mr. Biden has made democracy versus non-democracy the organizing principle of his foreign policy. From his perspective, it would be much more convenient if India was a booming, flourishing democracy. So the fact that there are all these really difficult questions about the quality and state of India's democracy means that it's awkward. And as you said, we have to make pragmatic choices in the world stage. Maybe have some private conversations with the Indian government and say, we have some concerns, but never talk about them in public, never talk about them when bilateral issues are at hand.
Does that mean it is acceptable to no longer be the democracy it once was?
Effectively so on the world stage, when you know that you have carte blanche to do what you want domestically and essentially not have any interference from outside, not have any scrutiny, it does allow you to maybe push the boundary, to take some chances with your democracy that you would not have if you worried that there'd be other countries sort of raising questions, that there might be embarrassing conversations to be had. The one thing about Mr. Modi is that he has stayed above the fray for the most part. In fact, the major criticism has been that his political party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, has a lot of people who are willing to say pretty problematic things about religious minorities, about freedom of the press. You have a lot of civil society forces, social forces that take law into their own hands, beat up Muslims, all sorts of other sort of violence. And Mr. Modi never says anything about it. So on the one hand, he has sort of a plausible deniability of India is a big country, it's a complicated country. I'm not doing it myself. But there's a real sense that this has official sanction from the very top, and at any rate, that lots of people feel like they can do anything they want and get away with it. And that's very problematic for a country that depends on the rule of law. You want to believe that if someone crosses a line, there'll be consequences. Right now, there don't appear to be any. And so you worry that as this becomes more and more normal, that there'll be greater excesses, right? What if there's another big riot in which hundreds, maybe 1,000 Muslims are killed in the streets of Delhi or in Gujarat or somewhere else in India? That's a situation then that cannot be ignored any longer. And then we have a really difficult situation for international capitals that have essentially been trying to walk the line of working with India because they recognize its economic potential, they recognize its geopolitical importance, but also trying not to say anything awkward or embarrassing about its democracy. At some point, one hopes it never comes to it, but at some point that could come to a head, and then we'd have a very difficult situation. In the meanwhile, we just accept that India's democracy is not as strong as it once was or as it could be, but we hope that it doesn't get any worse. We don't push to make it any better.
Well, at this point, we don't know what is going to happen in that respect. But as you said, this is an exercise in realpolitik. This was a pragmatic weighing up of priorities. What do you think the objectives of the two sides are?
The two main priorities are a stronger defense relationship. China is the biggest concern. They have slightly different needs on the China relationship. For India, there's a sense that India's military hardware has to be upgraded significantly in order to be competitive with the Chinese, especially on the land border in the northeast of India. American military sophistication exceeds anyone else's in the world. India has been buying weapon systems from Russia and the United States, but India recognizes that the technology that America has to offer is better than the Russian, and they would like to begin to get access to that. From the American perspective, they see India as an important military partner in the region. But for that to really work in the event someday of maybe a conflict with China, is for the US military and the Indian military to be much more in sync with each other. That requires that they get the Indians to stop buying Russian weapons and buying American weapons so the systems can be interoperable. And so the big announcements you're likely to see next week in the joint statement and in the fact sheets are more defense partnerships, more co-production of military weapons. That's good for India, and obviously it's good for the United States for weapon sales, etc. The second part of it is economics and trade. The United States learned the hard way that being overly reliant on China during COVID exposed its supply chains to all sorts of vulnerabilities. So supply chain resilience has become a major talking point in the United States, especially getting critical technologies out of China and to places that are more trusted. Secretary Yellen refers to friendshoring, for instance. India wants to be one of those friends because India needs more manufacturing and more economic activity in order to grow the economy, but also to provide more jobs to the millions of young people who are entering the workforce. So defense, both sides have a win-win potentially over there. India gets better weapons. America moves India away from Russian weaponry and into American weapon systems. And economic partnerships, the United States helps move its China supply chain resilience further along. India gets some share of that manufacturing that's moving out of China and hopefully into India.
Now, these are big moments for both countries, and I want to ask, of course, the United States has had reason to be wary of a closer defense cooperation with India because of its ties to Russia. Has the war in Ukraine created an opening there for the United States to say, perhaps now is the time to lessen your dependence on Russian weapons?
Well, in some ways, yes, and in many ways, no. I'd say in more ways, no. The yes is that I think the power of the US weapon systems has been on full display for the world, right? It's like a giant advertising campaign for American hardware. And I think the Indians, like every other country in the world, have recognized the superiority of American land-to-air weapon systems, of the drone technologies, and would like to get a share of that. But India has taken a very particular stance where Ukraine is concerned. They have made clear that they support peace in Ukraine, but have refused to condemn Russia, have in fact fought in all the joint communiques at the Quad, at the G20, to even refer to the conflict as a war, preferring to find other sorts of euphemisms for it. They are a major buyer of Russian oil, right? Arguably single-handedly kept the Russian economy afloat by the amount of oil that they bought. And I think there's a lot of frustration in the United States on Capitol Hill about the fact that India has not been a much better partner to the United States where Ukraine is concerned. So there is frustration over there. But I think the common theme is the United States, and particularly the Biden administration, just keeping its eye on the long term and telling India, in the long run, you want our weapons, not the Russian weapons. What do we have to do in order for you to go that way? They come up, though, against a much more confident India that sees a lot of leverage on its side. And I think the Indian government has learned a lesson over the last year and a half, which is that frankly it does not have to do a lot of what America would like it to do where Ukraine is concerned, where the world stage is concerned, because they understand that America's China problem is to India's advantage. And so for right now, they seem to think that they can have their cake and eat it too, if you would. They get both the benefits of a strong relationship with the United States without having to compromise their strategic autonomy when it comes to Russia. So it's complicated, and I would say in the long run, probably a bit of a loss for the United States and a win for India, because the US simply has not been able to get India to do as much as it would like.
Now, you've already said that India appears, at least on its face, to have the upper hand in this relationship. And when you talk about India's foreign policy, you often hear words you've already mentioned, like strategic autonomy, like non-alignment. This appears to have been right for India, no? It's worked out for them quite well.
I think it has. The phrase that the current government prefers to use is multi-alignment, the notion that India can have many friends. It is, of course, very consistent with the historical principle of non-alignment, that India will not take sides. I think the trade-off for India is going to be whether it can really get to where it wants on its defense capabilities and in some of the economic relationship if it doesn't make a more overt move towards the West. So right now they I think you're absolutely right. For right now, they've played it perfectly. They've gotten both the flexibility and the autonomy of a big independent country while getting a lot of goodies from the United States in exchange for the tacit support. But the United States still isn't giving India access to the most elite weapon systems. India would like to see a lot more technology transfer so that it can do indigenous production of these weapon systems. It would like a lot more economic activity to be located in India. And the United States, I think, is holding back on that because large parts of the bureaucracy in the Department of Defense, and the State Department of Commerce are still finding it hard to get the systems to sync up. And so at some point you've got to choose if you're going to get access to, I think, those most valuable resources that the United States brings. The other question, of course, is that US politics is volatile in its own right. But we don't know what will happen in 2024. And what if there's another government in 2024 or in 2028 or even in 2032 that looks at this ledger and says, hey, this hasn't played out the way we'd like it to play out, right? We have given a lot of stuff to India. We just haven't gotten anything in return at the same level. Then you potentially have a very different tone. So it's important to both think of this as a very important bipartisan relationship. Both Republicans and Democrats like the relationship, but not all of them feel equally comfortable with how it is shaping. So right now, the chairs of the Senate India caucus, a Republican and Democrat, have both made statements about how they feel like India did not have America's back when it came to Russia. Right? On the eve of a state visit, for senior senators, chairs of the India caucus, to be raising questions about that, does tell us that, India might have gotten away with it for right now, but whether it will continue to be able to play both sides indefinitely is really in question.
Well, what happens if the prevailing consensus eventually becomes India did not do enough for this relationship? There's no real way to put that genie back in the bottle.
That is absolutely right. So I think what we'll have is a carrot and a stick approach, which is that this carrot is going to be, we've given you a lot, but what you really need in order to be able to compete with the Chinese is even more, right? Potentially. It worries a lot about the state of its Navy. You want access to submarines, warships. The US Navy is leaps and bounds ahead of the rest of the world. So there are really tangible military capabilities that the United States possesses still that it hasn't made available to India. And I suspect behind the scenes you have a little more of that carrot and stick kind of approach. The other place that India is quite desperate, and maybe even more desperate, I use that word carefully, it has to figure out its economy. So India's economy is a bright spark in the world. On the world stage, it's expected to grow at maybe 6% this coming year. But in order to meet the size of its population, the large young population, and to catch up to China and the United States, it should be growing at 10% a year, year on year. It cannot do that without a lot more heavy manufacturing investment in India. And the United States market is the biggest market in the world, especially if India doesn't want to end up becoming too dependent on China. That's another place where the Indians would like to see America being much more aggressive and would like to see the Biden administration put a lot more pressure on American companies to say, you have to invest in India. We need this relationship to go. But American businesses are not in favor of being told where to take their dollars. And the Biden administration so far has not really put a lot of pressure, but India wants that. So I think there are places where the United States still has some pretty significant carrots to hold out in front of India. But you're absolutely right. They can't put the genie back, and no one wants to. The question is not whether they're going to suddenly turn India into, you're not our friend any longer, right? The question is, India is on the cusp of essentially being, as part of the Quad, standing aside Australia, Japan, and the United States. In lots of ways, it belongs in that group, but on economic indicators, on trade indicators, on military capability indicators, it is not an equal of any of those countries. If India wants to catch up to them, it needs the US's help. Otherwise, it stays in what one might call a middle-income trap, right? A large population that has a decent economy but not a great economy, and the gap between it and China continues to grow. And I think India would like to avoid that situation, and that gives the United States a lot of leverage, potentially.
Now, I want to go back to a point that you had made about the most advanced weapon systems not having been made available to India just yet, the US holding that back for now. But is there any way to see this visit by Modi and the deals that are expected to be signed as the beginning of a path that could open the way to them having the most advanced defense systems? Because a flurry of deals are expected to be signed. There will be technology transfers involved. Is this meant to open the path forward to that, I guess, ultimate goal, we can call it?
It is. It's a continuation of 20 years of investment. But there are still real challenges to the level of tech transfer that we're talking about. And right now, the awkward question being asked behind the scenes is, if we give you this stuff, how do we guarantee that it doesn't end up in Russian hands? How do we guarantee that it doesn't get captured by the Chinese, and then the Chinese have access to all that weaponry? So these are real concerns. It's not an antagonistic question, right? It's a question that reflects that the United States is very conscious of sort of what it has to offer and wants to be clear. India doesn't have good answers to those questions yet, so those remain off the table. The other place, of course, is that for the highest level weapon systems, you need Congress on board as well. And so the Biden administration has been by far the greatest champion. The White House executive wing has been the greatest champion of the relationship. But Congress has different priorities, right? Co-production and production in India means not less production in the United States. There are going to be senators who are going to say, why isn't that being produced over here, right? Why is it being produced over there? There'll be congressmen and maybe senators who might be willing to link that production to questions about human rights and democratization, for instance. So as we deepen that relationship, there's a lot more scrutiny on it, and things get a little more complicated. There's a lot more room to go, and for that, I think you're going to begin to see bigger, harder questions asked of India. And the question is whether India is capable of answering them satisfactorily for the United States. And right now, my answer would be they don't. They can't answer those questions effectively. And so I think that puts a ceiling on just how deep the relationship can go militarily, even if everyone would like it to go a lot further.
Just as a sort of side question, when you say that there are questions surrounding India's ability to keep its a high-level defense capability secure and away from Russian or Chinese hands, is there a good answer to that?
Not right now. So on the northeast border, the Chinese encroachment, to use the Indian phrase, of that border is they've literally reset the border, the effective border over there. There are reports of Indian technology being captured and taken by the Chinese. The Indian government has said very little about it. So I think there are real questions at the highest level of the DoD that say, what exactly is the capabilities and capacity of the Indian military, especially the land military, the army, to protect these weapon systems? That is one. I think where Russia is concerned, India has better answers. I mean, no one's really accusing the Indians of taking the weapon systems and sending them over to Moscow. So it's not about espionage or illicit sharing. But there are real questions about India's intellectual property rights regimes, right? Whether there's good enough, control. There's a couple of really apex organizations, corporations in India that have that kind of capacity. But the very best Indian companies that are now winning these contracts are still a long way from being world-class military companies. They're growing it, and I think the United States is saying, hey, we'll help you come along with that. But that's a very different landscape than, say, when they work with England, where they're talking as equals, both at the corporate production level and at the military intelligence level. But the India-US, I would think of it almost as a mentor-mentee relationship, saying, hey, we can help you get to where you want to go, but you're not there yet. And I think until you have much stronger private production capacity, a lot better systems in place legally, and then a question on the China side, there'll just constantly be room to wonder. And so India doesn't have good answers to those questions.
How does India feel about this characterization? If you were to call it a mentor-mentee relationship, you've already said
I have a feeling
India,
I'd get in a lot of trouble for it.
India is a much more confident country than it was.
It is a very confident country. It's also very, can sometimes be very thin-skinned and defensive. So I think on the public stage, they would reject that characterization, and that's their right to do it. I think on a private level, they would accept it and recognize that, at least on the weapons side of things, right, that there's a lot of room for them to learn. So the mentor-mentee sounds very hierarchical, but I think the notion that India sees its defense future as being tied to the United States defense establishment, and recognizing that it has to upgrade on the private and public contracting side its game in order to really be able to be attractive to the United States as a destination. I don't think there's any serious disagreement with that.
So some scenario building, say both sides get everything they want. How does that look like, and how does it impact the rest of the world?
I don't know that both sides can get everything they want, because they want something fundamentally different. What India wants is to be treated as an equal to the United States that has, sees it, has the same kind of capability set that the great powers of the world have, a functioning economy, but has tremendous autonomy over its foreign policy, strategic autonomy or multi-alignment. The United States has never worked in that manner. In some ways, the real challenge for the US is that India is a partner that defies easy characterization. So the relationship the United States has with Australia, or with Japan, or with the United Kingdom, or indeed with the NATO allies, is one in which the interests and values are really synced up and down the board. So the United States needs India to be a lot more aligned. India resists that alignment, so that's one place where I'm not sure we'll ever get in sync. But let's assume we did for scenario building. I think what we then have is both, on the positive side, a cooperative relationship that transforms India's economy for the good and opens up world trade in ways that it hasn't in a long time, because you get these very different supply chains that potentially run through Africa, through the Middle East, connecting South Asia to the United States, and you get a move away from East Asia and a China focus to a much more broadened economic trade relationship. That could only be a good thing. On the downside, I think you get a much more defensive China, and potentially a much more insecure China that now sees not only the US as a persistent threat, but a much stronger India that poses a threat, and China begins to feel encircled. India on its western border, the United States through its partnerships in Korea and Japan on the southern, and then, of course, the Pacific Ocean. And an insecure defensive China might be a scary thing for lots of countries around the world. You also have an X factor, which is, we haven't talked about Pakistan at all. But for much of the 20th century, independent Pakistan was America's primary ally in South Asia. And it was a major beneficiary of weapons sharing, a lot of economic aid. Pakistan has completely dropped off the US priority list. But an insecure Pakistan that does have access to nuclear weapons, that has a lot of incentive to sort of make sure the United States stays focused on it, could also be a bit of a troublemaker, could end up becoming in a relationship with, deepening its relationship with China. And suddenly you've turned South Asia into the epicenter of global tensions, three nuclear powers, China, India, and Pakistan, with the United States as an X factor in there. So I think we want to weigh the positive gains of a much stronger relationship economically, just better for the world economy, I would argue, with some of the potential downside risks of if the military partnership really takes strength, it would be naive to imagine that China and maybe Pakistan don't find themselves more insecure, and we'd want to think about what that insecurity could manifest itself as.
Essentially, you're saying there is something as too close when it comes to military relations between the countries.
I think, very nicely said, I think a relationship with India that really goes to alliance level, that where there's large amounts of American weaponry in India being operated by Indian soldiers, but also a much greater presence of American military forces in India, basing rights, for instance, joint operations in the Indian Ocean, changes the dynamics in the region and vis-a-vis China in ways that we have never seen before. And I do think that potentially could be become a major flashpoint if we put China in a corner. The Chinese economy is going to remain very strong and important. The Chinese military is pretty powerful already. So what we could have as that relationship gets tighter between the US and India is a sense in Beijing that what we want to do is strike at India before it gets too strong. Because once India gets past a particular point, we can't put that genie back in the bottle. Do we begin to see China interfere more in the northeast border? Do we see another war on that border? Do we see China investing more in Pakistan and saying, hey, cause some trouble in Kashmir? Could that escalate into another conflict? So in some ways, because we're moving into uncharted territory, the scenario building that we want to be responsible about is some of the downside risks. We are talking about three countries, all of whom have pretty significant nuclear weapons, all of which share a border. Right? It's been referred to as the most dangerous place on Earth. So changing the status quo has some real dangers. It also has some real positives. And the question is whether the United States and India can stay focused on the trade and economic relationships and not emphasize as much the anti-China militaristic side of the relationship as much. That's a difficult balancing act, but one hopes that they're capable of doing it.
How confident are you that these two governments, that the US and India, are able to strike this delicate balance between the opportunities present in closer ties, militarily and economically, and the necessary limits that you say have to be there?
I would put my confidence level maybe at 70%. I don't know, is that a high grade or low grade? It depends on where you're grading.
You're the professor.
Yeah. The positive is that there is much deeper multi-agency cooperation on both sides. So there are more Indian and American bureaucrats interacting with each other up and down the chain of command in many more dimensions than ever before. It's a deeper, richer, more multi-dimensional relationship. That's a real reason for optimism that they can get this right. India is also making much greater investments in its bilateral and multilateral relationships with Europe. There's a free trade agreement being negotiated with the UK. There's an early harvest free trade agreement with the EU. France and Germany and other European countries also see India as an important economic partner. That's really good because those are all part of the broader US liberal order. So you have India more generally drifting, if you would, towards the West, even if it isn't all the way over. I think that's all really positive and a reason for encouragement. The negative, or the constraints, less negative than constraints, is that how much of the current moment is because you have two leaders in Mr. Biden and Mr. Modi who have been willing to put all their political capital on the table in order to move the relationship forward. What if in 2024 it's not Biden again, but say Trump? Right? Do we imagine the same investment in the relationship as we currently have? I don't see why we would. I think we'd have a very different relationship. Does the relationship survive another Trump administration that says India's not done everything we want, and we're going to, in fact, sanction India, we're going to put some trade tariffs on India? Probably not. How far does it set it back? Mr. Modi is up for re-election in 2024. One expects that he will win election again, but he himself is going to be almost 75. At some point, there will be a post-Modi India. Does the leadership, the next generation of BJP leaders or the opposition, see the US-India relationship in the same way? So democracies at their fundamental tend to be good partners with each other because there is a fundamental alignment of values and principles. They also are subject to leadership turnover. And in both countries, you have leadership turnover in the offing, both due to longevity, they're both older leaders, and because of elections upcoming. And I think that serves as a real constraint, maybe my one pessimism, that I think we have right now two leaders who have said this relationship is really important, we're going to do what it takes to get it moving forward. But I'm not sure that that is as widely shared among the leadership class in both countries as we would want it to be confident that it will be the same 10 years from now, 20 years from now.
Irfan Nordin, thank you very much.
Thank you.